Do you ever think about those Wild West dinners? The ones you could only find in old cookbooks and nowhere else? Back then, these dinners meant survival, family, and a kind of grit you could taste with every bite. What happens when the meals that built a country vanish without a trace? This was not your average stew. Son of a Gun stew was a chuckwagon classic, made from every edible part of a calf: heart, liver, marrow, tongue, and sometimes even the brain if it had not gone to the dogs first. Cowboys did not waste a single bite, and the trail cook was expected to know how to turn those scraps into something halfway decent. The stew simmered in cast iron over open flame, thickened with flour or old coffee grounds, and flavored with salt if you were lucky enough to have it. A pot of Son of a Gun was more than food. It was a reminder that survival meant using everything you had, no matter how it looked or smelled going in. It filled you up, kept your strength, and tasted better than it had any right to after riding a horse all day. The name? That came from the fact that nobody ever wanted to admit what was actually in it. This was food for hard men under hard skies, and it stuck to your bones like nothing else. Sourdough was the cowboy's best friend, and not just for bread. You could take a little jar of starter across states and still have breakfast wherever you went. These flapjacks were not sweet or soft. They were chewy, dense, and packed with tang from the ferment. Fried right on a skillet greased with leftover pork fat, they went great with salt pork slices, heavily salted meat that was soaked and boiled until edible. Nobody called it elegant, but it worked. Cowboys ate it in the morning if they were lucky, or as a dinner when rations ran low. Salt pork was cheap, kept forever, and did not need refrigeration, which meant it could follow you to the middle of nowhere. These meals were eaten sitting on the ground, leaning against your saddle, with the fire crackling just out of reach. You did not eat for flavor. You ate because tomorrow was another 10 miles and you were already sore. This was fuel, not a feast, but it was also comfort in a place where comfort was rare. Prairie chicken was not chicken at all. It was wild grouse or quail, lean and gamey, and harder to catch than it was to cook. These birds were everywhere across the plains in the early days, and they fed whole families with just one shot and a lucky morning. The dressing, what we would now call stuffing, was made with old bread, sage, and whatever herbs you could find or grow in the yard. When it was baked in a cast-iron Dutch oven, the whole cabin would fill with the kind of scent that stopped everyone in their tracks. This meal showed up on tables for Sunday dinner or after a good hunting day. It reminded folks of home, even if that home was just 4 walls and a dirt floor. The meat might have been tough, the bread might have been stale, but put them together with sage and heat, and they made magic. No one complained. Not when it filled your belly and made the cold nights feel shorter. You might wrinkle your nose, but fried rattlesnake was a real meal on the frontier. If you were living off the land, you ate what the land gave you. And sometimes that meant a coiled-up surprise near your boots. Rattlesnake meat was surprisingly tender and mild, almost like chicken, and once you peeled the skin and cleaned the bones, it fried up fast. Cornmeal crust gave it crunch, and a sprinkle of pepper or dried herbs gave it flavor. Folks who lived near the desert or in rocky canyons got used to seeing these snakes. Some made it a sport to hunt them, others just got desperate enough to try. Either way, you dipped the meat in egg, rolled it in cornmeal, and dropped it in hot fat. It sizzled, popped, and came out golden. Eaten with dandelion greens or roasted roots, it was more than just edible. It was a story. One you told around a fire long after the danger was gone. This was no frozen grocery store pie. Venison pot pie came from hunters and homesteaders, made with fresh-shot deer meat that had been stewed for hours over low heat. It was mixed with carrots, potatoes, or wild onions if you had them, and poured into a rough pie crust made from flour and lard. The crust was thick, never flaky, and it needed to be. It had to hold up against days-old stew and keep well without a refrigerator. The pie would bake in a heavy Dutch oven, often buried in coals, while the smell filled the entire cabin. It was a special dinner, usually reserved for after a good hunt or around holidays when families gathered. You could slice it like cake and serve it warm or cold. It tasted like salt, smoke, and hard-earned luck. If you had enough venison to make 2, you stored 1 under a towel for the next day. No one ever said no to a second helping. This was the beating heart of cowboy cooking. Beans and bacon went everywhere, from wagon trains to cattle drives to back porch suppers. You started with pinto beans, dried and soaked overnight if you had the time. They were tossed into a big pot with water and a heavy slab of salt-cured bacon. That bacon was not the kind you fry for breakfast. It was dense, brined, and meant to last. As it cooked, the beans soaked up all the fat and salt, turning soft and smoky. You stirred it with a wooden spoon, checked the fire, and hoped it would be done by sundown. There were no frills, just beans, pork, and patience. If you had a biscuit or a chunk of cornbread on the side, you counted yourself lucky. This was a meal that stuck with you, gave you warmth, and made sure you could ride or work all the next day. Rabbit was one of the few meats you did not have to buy. You trapped it, you skinned it, you cooked it over a low flame and gave thanks for every bite. Stewed rabbit with wild onions was a meal of real effort. Catching the meat was half the battle, but cleaning it was even harder. Once in the pot, the meat softened slowly, and the onions, dug from fields or creek beds, gave it a sweet, peppery edge. Sometimes folks added vinegar or dried apples just to stretch the flavor. You could serve it over biscuits or eat it straight from the pot. This was food for people who made do with what they had and did not ask for more. It was quiet, filling, and honest. A dish that reminded you that hunger does not care about preferences. You ate to keep going. You ate because something had to. Cornmeal mush was the grit beneath the grit. You boiled it into a thick, almost rubbery porridge that could be eaten hot with butter or poured into a tin, chilled overnight and sliced for frying. On cold frontier mornings, it was the fastest way to feed a family and keep them moving. Add a slice of sausage, pan-fried and dripping with molasses, and you had something that felt like luxury. This was the kind of meal you ate before walking into a snowstorm, cutting wood, or birthing a calf. It was hot, sticky, and stuck in your teeth, but you would not complain. Molasses was easier to find than sugar and lasted longer in the pantry. That one spoonful made you feel like everything was just a little sweeter than it was. This dish might sound plain, but back then it tasted like gold. This was not an everyday dinner. Buffalo meat was a rare and sacred thing, hunted with care and shared with reverence. When settlers got their hands on some, they treated it like a holiday. The roast was slow cooked over fire or buried in a pit with hot stones, and the juices were thickened into a gravy, using wild juniper berries crushed with a rock or spoon. The result was smoky, slightly bitter, and rich beyond measure. Juniper gave it that wild taste, something sharp, something old. This dish came from a time when nothing was farmed and everything was earned. It fed big families, whole camps, or traveling parties headed west. Nobody wasted a bite, and nobody ever forgot the taste. Hominy was corn, but tougher. It had to be soaked in lye, boiled until it puffed and split, then rinsed again and again to make it safe to eat. What came out was chewy, earthy, and just strange enough to feel like something ancient. It was not the kind of corn you threw on the cob. This was corn that had been through something. Fatback, on the other hand, was just what it sounded like. Thick slices of pork fat, cured with enough salt to last through the hottest summers and coldest winters. On their own, each ingredient was rough. But together, they became a dish that worked like fuel. You layered the hominy and fatback in a pot, sometimes added a little grease or onion, and baked it until it bubbled up thick and heavy. The top might brown if the fire was hot enough, but even when it did not, nobody turned it down. It was dense, it was greasy, and it stuck to your ribs like armor. In a place where meals were counted in effort, not elegance, this one always showed up on time. It did not ask to be liked, just eaten. Riverside meals were always about what you could pull out of the water, and catfish was as good as it got. Thick-bodied, whiskered, and slippery, they were a challenge to catch but worth every second of the fight. Once cleaned, the fillets were dunked in flour or cornmeal and fried in a skillet over open flame until they sizzled brown at the edges. The oil crackled, and the fish turned crisp on the outside and soft as butter inside. What made this dish stand out, though, was the sorghum vinegar sauce. Made from syrup cooked down with sharp vinegar and sometimes a dash of wild herbs, it was poured over the catfish just before eating. The sweetness hit first, then the tang, then the smoke from the fire itself. It was an evening meal that brought comfort after long days of river labor or ferry hauls. Served with beans or wild greens, it was not fancy, but it had bite. And in a world where meat came with risk, the catfish was a dependable gift. If you knew how to clean it right, season it just enough and keep your fire steady, you could turn a slippery catch into something you would dream about again tomorrow. Pemmican was survival food at its most basic: dried meat, fat, and berries mashed into cakes that could last for months without spoiling. But out on the frontier, folks found ways to turn it into something hot and hearty when supplies ran low. Enter the pemmican hot dish, which was exactly what it sounded like. Pemmican fried up in a skillet with whatever else was on hand: onions, turnips, wild greens, or even a spoonful of leftover beans. The meat, usually deer or buffalo, had been dried until leathery and ground into pieces. The fat came from tallow, rendered down in iron pots until it was clear and clean. It all came together in one sizzling, heavy pan. It did not smell great, but it tasted like energy, and it gave you the strength to do whatever was needed the next day. You could eat it with a biscuit or flatbread if you had any left, but often you just scooped it straight from the pan with your knife. This was the kind of food you made when there was no room for complaints. You ate it quietly, with the fire spitting and the wind outside your cabin walls. It filled the space where comfort used to live. Scrapple was the kind of thing you either grew up on or would never understand. It was a loaf made of pork scraps, cornmeal, and seasoning, formed into a block, chilled overnight, then sliced and fried thick in a pan. The result was something between a meatloaf and a fried cake, with crispy edges and a soft, savory middle. The gravy was simple. You took the drippings left in the pan, added some flour and water, and stirred until it bubbled. That was poured straight over the scrapple like syrup on pancakes. There was no polite way to eat it. You cut it, scooped it, and sopped it up with whatever you had. It was greasy, dense, and completely satisfying. Scrapple came from people who knew that meat did not end with the tender cuts. It was a poor man's roast, made with brains, hearts, or necks, if that was all you had. But no one dared call it second-rate. It was breakfast, lunch, or dinner depending on the day. And when the weather was cruel and the wood was wet, scrapple and gravy reminded you that with a little time and grease, even scraps could become something worth waiting for. Elk meat was a prize, and the shoulder was the biggest piece you could get your hands on if you were lucky enough to bring one down. Smoky, thick, and hard to cook, it took patience and skill to turn that shoulder into dinner. Hunters in the wild preserved the meat by hanging it over juniper or hickory smoke until it was dark and dry on the outside. Then it was roasted slowly, either over a flame or buried deep in coals. The glaze was made from tallow, that golden fat rendered down from the same elk, brushed on top every hour to keep the meat moist and glistening. The smell alone was worth the wait. Rich, wild, and earthy, it filled every inch of the cabin or campsite. When it was ready, you carved off thick slices and passed them around by hand. No one talked, they just chewed. You served it with root vegetables if you had them, or dunked it in hot broth made from the bones. This was the kind of meal you told stories about later. It was hard-earned, and that made it taste better than anything you could buy, then or now. Beans were always part of the story, but when you had molasses and bear grease, the story changed. This dish started in open ovens or cast iron pots that sat on hearthstones. Dry beans, navy, kidney, or pintos, were soaked, boiled, and then mixed with thick, dark molasses. That alone was a meal. But what made it unforgettable was the drizzle of bear grease poured on top just before serving. Bear grease was liquid gold. Rendered slowly from bear fat over a fire, It had a deep, smoky richness that made even the plainest dish feel like celebration. You did not always have it, but when you did, you used every drop. The beans baked slowly, the molasses caramelized, and the bear grease brought it all together like the last note in a song. This was not something you served to guests. It was something you served to family, people who knew what hunger meant. The beans filled your belly, the sweetness lifted your mood, and the fat kept you going through the coldest nights. It was the kind of food that made you feel like maybe, just maybe, you would make it through the winter after all. Succotash was one of the earliest examples of how settlers and native communities crossed paths at the dinner table. Originally a Native American staple, it was a mix of beans, squash, and corn. On the frontier, it got a twist. People started adding dried venison or jerky, torn into strips and boiled until soft, to give it weight. It was made in cast iron, over fire, with whatever vegetables you had lying around or growing wild nearby. If there was fat, it came from pork grease or marrow bones. If there was seasoning, it was usually just salt and thyme. Everything went into the pan, and you let it bubble until the flavors blended and the scent filled the room. It was a one-pot meal with no frills, but a lot of heart. You spooned it into bowls or ate it right from the pot. It was shared, passed around, and eaten in silence by people who had worked all day and would work all night. It was more than survival food. It was an offering, a reminder that even strangers had something to teach each other about making the most out of very little. Mustang meat was never the first choice, but in desperate times, it was a last resort that kept people alive. Wild horses roamed the plains, and while most folks saw them as work animals or symbols of freedom, hunger turned them into meat on the fire. Mustang chili was rough, bitter, and hot. The meat was tough and needed hours of cooking. You boiled it, chopped it, and stewed it with dried pinto beans and chilies that had been strung and sun-dried for months. The spices were simple, whatever you could grind up or find in the pantry. It was not about flavor, it was about fuel. This was the kind of dish made when snow was falling and nothing else moved. You did not talk about what kind of meat it was while you ate it. You just chewed, swallowed, and kept going. For many, this was a secret meal, something they remembered but never spoke of again. But it mattered. It filled stomachs when there was nothing left to count on. And for that reason, it earned its place in old cookbooks, scribbled in pencil with no title, just one word: chili. Ox tongue was not thrown away. It was boiled, peeled, sliced, and stewed into one of the richest meals you could get without spending a cent. Ox tongue and onion stew was thick, gelatinous, and sticky with flavor. You started by simmering the tongue in salted water for hours, until the outer skin peeled off like paper. Then you sliced the meat and tossed it into a pot with onions, sometimes potatoes, and a bit of fat if you had it. The broth turned brown, the meat turned soft, and the smell took over the room. It was not pretty, but it fed a family. Ox tongue was often free or near it at the butcher, because no one wanted it. That made it a working man's dish, something that proved you knew your way around a tough cut and could turn it into something to be proud of. The onions melted into sweetness, and the meat melted on your tongue. You could eat it over bread or scoop it out with a spoon, and either way it reminded you that respect was not just for the fancy parts. It was for whatever you made count. Wild turkey was a prize on any table, especially out on the plains where game was lean and days were long. If you brought one down, it meant a real dinner was coming, and not just meat, but the kind of meal you told the neighbors about later. The meat was roasted, pulled, and chopped, then stuffed into a pastry made from flour, lard, and a little bit of hope. The crust was thick and greasy, flaky if you were lucky, and baked in a Dutch oven right in the hearth. You basted it with tallow from beef or pork, just enough to give the top a shine. It baked slow, filled the room with warmth, and came out golden brown and steaming. The filling might include onions or dried apples if you had them. But even plain, the meat carried the show. This was not a pie for casual meals. This was a pie you made for a family reunion or a hard-earned feast after days of nothing but beans. When you cut into it, the knife went soft through the crust and hit meat that tasted like the woods, the fire, and everything in between. Coffee was not just for drinking. On the trail, it doubled as a spice, a rub, and sometimes even a way to keep the meat from going bad too fast. Chuckwagon cooks used coffee grounds to crust salt-cured ham hocks before roasting. The result was earthy, smoky, and just bitter enough to cut through the fattiness of the pork. You took the ham hock, rubbed it down with old coffee grounds, maybe mixed with pepper or dried herbs, then set it in the fire pit or oven to roast for hours. When the crust turned black and the inside turned pink and juicy, it was ready. Served with beans. Always beans. It made a full meal that kept you full and grounded. The coffee gave it a charred kick, something no other spice could mimic. And the smell? That was campfire cooking at its finest. No plates needed, just a slab of meat, a tin of beans, and a spoon. It was a dinner that looked burned but tasted like comfort. And no one ever asked how or why it worked. It just did. Mule deer was the kind of meat that did not come easy. You needed skill, patience, and a shot that counted. But when you brought one down, you made it last. And skillet hash was one of the best ways to stretch every scrap. Chopped deer meat was tossed into a cast iron pan with onions, leftover potatoes, and sometimes apples from a nearby orchard if it was fall. The apples turned soft and sweet, the meat browned at the edges, and the smells mixed into something you could not forget. It was savory, it was smoky, and it had that bite of sweetness that made everything hit just right. A dash of vinegar or a drizzle of fat tied it all together, and suddenly the meal felt complete. You ate it with a spoon if you had one, or a crust of bread if you did not. This was breakfast for some, dinner for others, but for everyone it was survival turned into something warm. Mule deer and apples might not seem like a match, but when you are cold, tired, and out of options, they make a mighty good team. Yes, people really ate prairie dog, and no, it was not a joke. These little animals were everywhere in the open West, and when supplies were low, homesteaders turned to whatever they could trap. Prairie dog was skinned, gutted, and boiled with turnips or potatoes, whichever root vegetable was still hanging on in the cellar. The meat was lean and a little gamey, but boiled long enough, it softened into something close to rabbit. You would not serve it to company, but it fed the kids and kept everyone on their feet. There were no fancy spices, just salt if you had it, and wild onions if you got lucky. The turnips soaked up the broth and carried the meal further. Some folks called it stew, others called it shame. But out there on the frontier, pride took a back seat to hunger. This was food from the edge of desperation, and it never made it into the cookbooks with fanfare. Still, if you dig deep enough, you will find it scribbled on old pages. Prairie dog, turnips, water, thyme. It may not sound like much, but it kept the fire burning. When someone slaughtered a hen, you knew it was a rare kind of day. Chicken was not everyday food. It was a once-in-a-while prize, saved for Sunday or when guests came calling. Smothered sorghum chicken over grits turned that rare event into a full table spread. The hen was cut into pieces, browned in a skillet, then simmered in sorghum syrup, vinegar, and a little spice until the sauce went sticky and rich. It was sweet, sharp, and clung to the chicken like molasses. Underneath, a mound of stone-ground grits soaked up every drop. The grits were made from dried corn, boiled into a thick mush, and stirred with salt and fat until they held shape. Together, they made a plate that felt heavier than gold. You did not need a second helping to feel full. This was dinner that made people lean back and loosen their belts. It was celebration on a plate, built out of scraps and syrup. And when the hen was gone, you remembered the flavor longer than you remembered the effort. The desert did not give much, but if you knew where to look, it gave enough. Cactus, or nopales, grew wild and thick, and once you cleaned off the spines, it became one of the best survival vegetables you could find. Pinto beans were cheap, dried, and kept forever in a sack tied to the wagon. Together, they made a stew that was filling, earthy, and better than it had any right to be. The cactus softened down into a slippery green bite with a hint of tang, while the beans thickened the pot and made sure no one left hungry. Spices came from the land, chili if you had it, or salt scraped from dried-out creek beds. Sometimes there was onion, garlic, even corn, but usually it was just beans, cactus, water, and thyme. The result was hot, savory, and rich in a way only the desperate can appreciate. You ate it with a spoon, if you had one, or soaked it up with dry flatbread. Cactus and pinto bean stew was a desert answer to dinner, and it never failed to do the job. Cooking meat in an iron pot slung over the fire was as close as some folks got to luxury. It was simple, heavy, and honest. You would hang the pot from a tripod or a tree branch, load it with meat, anything from beef scraps to squirrel, and let it sit all day in the heat. Dandelion greens, pulled from the yard or field, were boiled down and served right alongside. The greens were bitter but full of iron, and the meat turned soft enough to break with a fork if you had one. You could flavor it with bacon fat or leftover gravy, but most often it was just thyme and fire doing the work. The smell drifted for miles. That smell was how you knew someone was eating well that night. You spooned it into wooden bowls or tin plates, sopped up the juices with crusty bread, and let the warmth fill you from the inside out. This was food that started in the dirt and ended in your gut. Nothing wasted, nothing fancy, just a pot, a flame, and what the land could give. Slumgullion stew did not come with a recipe. It came with whatever you had left in the bottom of your sack. A little meat, a handful of beans, some soft potatoes, a cracked carrot, half an onion. It all went in. The pot was hot, the fire was steady, and if you were lucky, you had enough biscuit dough or flour paste to thicken it all up into something resembling dinner. Some folks added bacon drippings. Others threw in a chunk of dried sausage or jerky. The name Slumgullion itself sounded like something made in desperation, and that was exactly what it was. A dump stew, a last hope meal. But somehow, it always worked. The flavors melted together, the texture turned hearty, and no one left the table hungry. This was cowboy cooking at its most unpretentious, and that was saying something. You made do, and you kept moving. Because tomorrow, who knew what would be in the pot, or if there would be anything at all? Prairie hen was lean and tough, but when baked slow in a Dutch oven, it turned into something worth sitting down for. You stuffed it with cornbread made from stone-ground meal, lard, and dried herbs, whatever sage, thyme, or onion powder you had stashed in a jar or pouch. The hen was rubbed with salt, sometimes molasses or bear fat, and placed in the cast-iron oven with hot coals stacked on the lid and underneath. The slow bake let everything soften. The bird, the bread, the tension in the room. The smell of wild meat and savory cornbread baking together was enough to stop conversation, even before the plates came out. It was food that asked for silence and earned it. You carved it right at the table, handed out thick slices, and spooned the stuffing alongside like it was Thanksgiving dinner, even if the calendar said it was Tuesday. Even when the meat was a little chewy or the cornbread came out too dry, nobody made a face. You were eating prairie hen with cornbread stuffing. That alone meant you were doing all right. In places where luxury was just heat and enough food to go around, this dish felt like celebration. The kind of meal that filled the room, filled the stomach, and left behind a memory stronger than most. Not bad for a bird that most people never even see anymore. Pickled pig's feet were not everyone's favorite, but they lasted forever and packed more flavor than you would expect from a jar of toes. Brined in vinegar, salt, and a few rough spices, the feet turned tender and rubbery over time, soaking up sharpness like a sponge. You ate them cold or warmed up just enough to loosen the gelatin and fat, always served with something plain on the side. Boiled grain mash made the most sense. Cracked wheat, cornmeal, or barley boiled until thick, gray, and steady enough to hold shape on a spoon. Together, they made a dish that was briny, chewy, and undeniably strange to anyone who did not grow up with it. But it worked. The fat from the feet soaked into the mash like gravy, and the vinegar woke up your tongue just enough to keep you reaching for another bite. You would not see it in a restaurant, then or now. But on a cold night in a lonely shack with one window and a leaky roof, it filled you up and reminded you that no part of the pig went to waste, not even the ones that walked. It was a hard meal, but it was honest, and honest meals are the ones that kept people alive. Ash-cooked potatoes were the kind of meal you made with nothing but a fire and a little bit of time. You wrapped whole potatoes in wet rags or thick leaves, sometimes just tossed them bare into the coals, and waited until the heat worked its way through the dirt and skin. The outside would blacken, the inside would steam, and by the time you dug them out, they were soft enough to split open with a stick. All you needed then was a spoonful of bear lard or bacon grease to turn them into something that felt like comfort. You cracked the skin with a knife, let the smoke curl out, and spooned the fat in until it ran down your fingers. There was no plate, there was no side dish. Just you, the fire, and a potato that tasted like it remembered the earth it came from. This was the taste of campfires and cold nights, of hunger turning into satisfaction, one quiet bite at a time. Potatoes were cheap, lard was earned, and together they made a meal better than most people remember. If you could find a hot ember, you could find dinner, and in the Wild West, that counted for everything. Rough Rider goulash was not elegant, but it got the job done. It started with dried noodles, often homemade or broken from a block, boiled just enough to soften. Then came leftover meat, beef, venison, squirrel, rabbit, or whatever else had been caught, cured, or scraped off the bone, tossed into the pot with chopped onions, a splash of vinegar, and whatever grease could be spared. Sometimes it was bacon fat. Other times it was tallow left over from roasting. The whole mix simmered just long enough to turn the sharp edges into warmth. It was not quite stew. It was not quite soup. Somewhere in the middle, it filled bowls with something hot and heavy and good enough to eat after a full day of riding, marching, or hauling water. The name came from the cavalry, but the recipe came from hunger. You could make it in a trench, a tent, or a crumbling shack, and no matter what you put in, it always turned out familiar. Salty, smoky, a little bit sour, it was food for those who did not ask for more than what they had. And sometimes, that was exactly enough. Pickle roll-ups, on the other hand, were a wonderful party-time snack that became the star of two types of gatherings: cocktail parties and potlucks. See, in potlucks, it was really common for people to bring one of everything and just have a lot to eat for the family, but cocktail parties were an entirely different kind of beast. The post-World War II era in America was a strange one. It saw lots of cultural shifts and new trends that people couldn't have ever guessed would make some serious headway into the mainstream. Despite that, these parties that were pretty much just wine-tasting parties but with cocktails turned into little competitive nights where people would compare their finger foods and the host would try their damnedest to pick a menu that suits everyone's tastes. By the end of it, no one would really even get drunk. What they would get, though, is pretty tipsy. And you must not be a stranger to the need for snacking that arises when the drinks start hitting. Casual gatherings that were cocktail parties also saw a lot of use for pickle roll-ups, and as far as snacks went, this was a pretty good option for hosts who couldn't spend a lot of time doing prep work. Hoppin John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good, so maybe it does work? Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. If we go back just a bit before the war and right towards the start and middle of the Depression, you'll find that chipped beef on toast was actually one of the most common things to eat, especially across working class and rural households. There were people who had their own farms and space to grow and raise their own cattle. They would often enjoy the best versions of these. Then the rest of the population would usually be working on much tougher and cheaper cuts of meat from unwanted parts of the animals, like the back or the shoulder. It meant that the quality of the meat was something you had to work around, typically by slow cooking it so you'd get some tenderness. Still, most people really just had bread to work with. The bread was also very prone to going stale, and the beef wasn't something you could use in decent or large amounts just because you were having a bad day. It was the Depression, you know? Everyone was collectively having a bad day. Chipped beef on toast was an easy way for people to spice up their bread just a little while still being able to eat a decent breakfast. Hoppin John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. In the 1960s, Beanie weenies weren't some kind of cute wintertime trend with beanies or a Halloween candy. They were actually something you'd see in school cafeterias almost all of the time. Why? What is a beanie weenie? Well, despite what it sounds like, it's actually a pretty good mix of baked beans, hot dogs, and some ground beef. This meant that it was one of the most popular mixes for parents to make during times when they had to get to work, but their kid had to get to school faster. If you're one of those people who never finds enough time to make a breakfast from scratch in the morning for their little critter, I think you might still see the value in something like this. How did beanie weenies emerge, though? Well, between pop culture references in shows like The Simpsons and The Goldbergs, a list of stores in every area selling affordable canned versions of the ingredients, and beanie weenies in general sneaking into all aspects of American life, even the military. I'd say the dish has had many places to grow some really positive PR for itself. Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like apple betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane, where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. Potato pancakes are a lot more cultural than you think. They're deeply rooted in European Jewish traditions, and even in American Jewish communities, you always find this in someone's fridge. They have some pretty strong links to the cuisine, but despite that, the 20th century was a time when America really became known for being a melting pot of different cultures. Before that, you could say that each place had its own identity, each state its own little corner of Uncle Sam's backyard, but now it really is all one big pot. In the United States, they're typically something most people link together with Hanukkah, but they're also a really big comfort food outside of that too. There's some practical history and some cultural Jewish history to this. So, practically speaking, during the Depression and wartime, people almost exclusively lived off of potatoes. Potato skins, potato soup, potato pancakes. I mean, it was one of the cheapest and easiest ways to get a pancake during then. From there on, it took off so well that most people just kept making them even after the dust settled. It was a pretty endearing exchange of traditions from one community to another. And to be honest, I think I like potato pancakes more than the original. What about you? Would you ever try a starchy variant of a typical American breakfast, or are you booking it straight to IHOP? Bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously, and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then, and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, and despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread, and sure, it was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else, but Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies, and this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? American-type goulash became a comfort food that was known for so many things that made your life easy. Simplicity, typically, was what people wanted during this time. Think about it. Work culture has only gotten worse in our generation. You come home clocking that 9-to-5 shift? What's the first thing that goes in your head? Maybe hop in the kitchen, thaw some chicken, and dirty your hands with some spices and grease? Come on, dude, no. You want to catch up on some Z's. Take a power nap. Get some of your pep back, you know? American goulash was such a good dish exactly because it let you do all of these things while still having a full stomach. In some places, you'd call it chop suey, but really, depending on the region you were in, you would see something entirely different. Some people had the whole thing consisting of this rich tomato sauce with diced and boiled tomatoes to go with it. Others really thought you couldn't make it work without a big focus on ground beef. This was the most popular option since, out of everything, ground beef being the center of the dish made it both affordable and familiar. Then, some people also really liked elbow macaroni. It was a pretty common sight to see in American goulash. The dish tasted very homely, and you could feed a family of 5 or more with one batch. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Remember how we were just talking about the way people decided to sometimes mess around with their casseroles, switch out the ground beef and put in sausages instead? Yeah, they had a name for that too. It was called hot dog casserole. Like almost every casserole that made its claim to fame during the 1960s, this one had a heaping serving of pasta. Actually, elbow macaroni is something you'd see a lot more often with this one, mixed in between patches of gooey cheddar cheese and diced or cut-up sausages. It was actually a pretty economical dish, and that's why it got popular in areas where common ingredients weren't so readily available. Let's talk about personality, though. Do we take this over a hot dog? How do we feel about the casserolification of almost everything? I mean, before I told you this, Your idea of a hot dog was probably just the typical street food dog you get in a bun. Then again, maybe this is an idea worth trying. If sausages can work in a hot pot, there's no reason they can't work in a casserole. What do you say? In what form do you think the hot dog shines through more? We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American Slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913. And it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. I'm glad potato pancakes and jambalaya are next to each other, because both are some pretty fine examples of how a lot of typical American meals are influenced by the many cultures and communities that exist within the nation. Jambalaya, for instance, is a Creole and Cajun original that comes right from the heart of Louisiana. It's got a fair bit of heritage from other cuisines too, namely Spanish and French ones. Jambalaya was typically introduced to the people by French settlers who had brought on most of their recipes and ways of cooking during the very early colonial time of America, specifically Louisiana. What they didn't foresee is that one-pot culture would end up popping off so well in America, and that's exactly the mold jambalaya fit into as well. Even up in the land of the oui, or as they call it, France, they would typically cook this in one pot. In Louisiana, though, in the rural patches of land surrounding the state where plantations were, it was a typical meal there since a lot of the dish was centered around rice. And that was a staple. In the 1960s, Southern cuisine, especially out of places like Louisiana, had really stretched out to other parts of the country. All of this note-taking from other people's books has a reason, by the way, and I'll get into that later. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Speaking of Southern cuisine creeping into other corners of the country, pimento cheese sandwiches are the quintessential Southie dish to talk about. As far as sandwiches go, they've pretty much nailed the formula. You have a taste you won't really forget thanks to the wonderful usage of pimento cheese, which is really just cheddar cheese mixed with small red peppers known as pimentos. Then, you have the sauces and vegetables. People like to keep it pretty simple, nothing too fancy. They'd throw in some red onions, or normal ones, and cloves of garlic. Some cayenne pepper and jalapenos would make it even spicier, but some people really preferred their cheese sandwiches that way. I know that at least more than a few people really enjoyed doing it this way up in the South. As far as sauces went, most people stuck to Worcestershire sauce for how it would really add some depth to the dish. The pimento cheese sandwich was one of the best things to come out of the South, because it was such an affordable and delicious meal to make. Pimento cheese wasn't really the hardest thing to get. If you lived near any kind of grocery store, then there was a pretty good chance they had it. Most people in the South also either grew their own peppers or had dedicated shops and spots for where they'd go. Everyone had their own favorites when it came to where they'd like to get their vegetables, so depending on the harvest, you'd also get some pretty different tastes. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. Corned beef hash was a real silver lining for most people to look forward to. While corned beef itself came out of Ireland, it got to the US by the 19th century, but by the middle of the 20th, it was obvious that this Irish invention had made a very American home for itself. Lots of big-name corporations also helped spread the hype around, typically Hormel's. They were the most affordable ones to get, and they were also the best quality for a few reasons. That shelf life was really nothing to scoff at, and it was a pretty hefty serving of beef in a very transportable can. Corned beef has such a rich history throughout the 20th century. In the 1960s, it was a fast way to get mashed potatoes, vegetables, and a protein on your plate and chow down. Just 20 to 30 years before that, it was actually one of the biggest things you needed to make sure you had because it was a big part of most people's very frugal daily diet. Scrapple is pretty common in Pennsylvania even today, but it started in the 1930s as a mush of pork trimmings with cornmeal or buckwheat and some minimal spices. Since people had limited options for their culinary ventures, most Scrapple were not as tasty as they could have been. That does not mean it lacked a kick, though, as most people found that even for trimmings, it worked pretty amazingly overall. People would regularly make it a habit to ask their butcher to save any scraps that were left over or unused because they had some Scrapple in mind for today's menu. Especially in the Mid-Atlantic in places like Virginia, Delaware, Washington, and South Jersey. People would use offal too and make a broth out of the bones, though in the end any bones and fat were taken out of the dish. Slumgullion stew is an American dish that became known for how easy it was to prepare. I mean, seriously, you think of stews, and your mind immediately goes to all the hard work and blood and sweat that goes into making a proper one, especially if you're cooking for a decently sized group. Some of these stews could get real costly too, but not Slumgullion, no. This dish was a comfort food recipe that had been twisted, diluted, and transformed in so many ways across the decades, but still always managed to retain what made it work. That's very rare for most recipes, as they often lose their original essence in translation from one era to another. A Slumgullion stew typically looks like lots of beef, macaroni, greens like canned tomatoes, corn, and beans. And they would also throw in chili beans and vegetable soups to add to the broth. By the 1960s, suburban living had become the norm, and a family diner was what most people were buying their groceries for. Slumgullion stew was a mouthful to eat and say, so it worked really well. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. If these frontier meals left you curious or queasy, drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe for more forgotten flavors from America's past.